Hi, it's Penny here, and I'm going to be reviewing the Between Earth and Sky trilogy by Rebecca Roanhorse, which started with The Black Sun, then the second book was Fevered Star, and the final book, Mirrored Heavens, came out at the start of 2024. So this is a series inspired by pre-Columbian American mythology. We basically have a bunch of different characters representing the different gods kind of coming together for this bigger conflict. We start with Serapio, whose mother has gone to some quite extreme lengths to build a connection between him and the crow god. He joins up with Shiala, who is a woman from this island of women where they kill any male sons and they have a connection with the sea goddess. So Shiala is giving Serapio basically a ride to the capital where we have Nara, the sun priestess, who's dealing with quite a lot of politics and some assassination attempts. And there's also kind of a bunch of other political groups. We have the Golden Eagles, the Water Striders, the Winged Serpents, some kind of jaguar guy. I always forget all the tribes. To be honest, it's been a while since I read the first couple of books, and especially the second book was not the best in my opinion, so I've forgotten a lot about it. What I will say though is, in preparation for this review, I went back and watched my previous videos where I talked about these books, and I noticed for every single book I said, this felt like a lot of setup, but I feel like there's a lot of potential for the next book to do great things. And even the last book, halfway through, I was like, well, it's been a lot of setup so far, but there's a potential for a really great ending. Now, in my opinion, it never really delivered on that potential. So I thought in this review, I'll kind of go through each of the things that I thought were really great in the beginning and then didn't quite get delivered on. I will say that this series actually has really great average ratings on Goodreads. And in fact, the last book has the highest average rating of 4.27 currently. So when I say the final book was a disappointment, obviously that's not something that's agreed on by everyone. So I did have a look at other people's reviews to try and get an indication of like whether you might be someone who really loves that last book, like a lot of people, whether you might be disappointed in the ending like me. And from what I could tell, people who felt very emotionally engaged in the characters from the very beginning or from that first book seem to have managed mostly to have continued that emotional engagement. So if you have read Black Sun and you really, really love the characters, then I think you might still enjoy the whole series. But now I'm going to go ahead and tell you what I didn't like about it. So firstly, the first book had such great momentum. The structure was set up where we had all these different characters coming together. We knew that at a set time and a set location, that's where they were all going to meet up, and we could see the conflict building between the different perspectives. And it did that thing that some books do so well when you've got multiple perspectives, where you learn one thing in one perspective and you know the negative impact that that's going to have on another character, and so you're anticipating them finding out about it. And so even though you're jumping between multiple perspectives, you've got this constant anticipation about what's going to happen next. And then the conclusion of that first book was also quite epic and quite satisfying. Like there was a bit of a cliffhanger, to be honest. Then we got to the second book. The second book was also a lot of traveling, but it felt like filler, to be honest. I don't really even remember a lot of that second book. I've seen a lot of people say that they felt it was filler, like really suffering from that middle book syndrome. There were a lot less connections between the different perspectives. So while some were still very exciting, when you would skip to the more boring perspectives, it would seem even more boring because it didn't really have any relevance to anything. And weirdly, actually, the most epic part of the second book was kind of in the middle of the book, where there was a bit of a magical battle. So honestly, the most exciting bits of this whole series, in my opinion, were the end of the first book and the middle of the second book. And it's a bit of a shame that we didn't get any of that excitement in the third book. I feel like the third book was almost trying to do too much in terms of the plot. There were so many different plot lines going on, so many different perspectives, and some of what was set up was like barely even shown on page. Especially one of the whole storylines, I felt it was just wrapped up in a quick chapter, kind of telling you high level what happened, which was very unsatisfying. And then the very, very ending was just so convenient. Once again, I think maybe emotionally satisfying if you were really in love with the characters, but I think especially as someone who's read a lot of fantasy, the ending felt very tropey and a little bit generic. and I honestly would have wanted more for some of the characters. So let's talk about the characters. In the first book, I thought the characters all seemed so distinct and unique, and that's actually what I loved the most about the series. Especially Serapio had gone through so much trauma but managed to still be such a kind person. And then Shiala was such a badass in the beginning. Like, a lot of the characters felt really great. There is also really great non-binary representation in this book series. It's particularly done in a way where there's no questioning in these different cultures that some people are non-binary, and I thought the use of non-standard pronouns was done very naturally within the narrative. So in my opinion, a lot of what I loved about the first book was these great characters. But the problem is, because this book is written multi-perspective, each character really only gets a handful of chapters. So then in later books, when we start adding in even more perspectives, we're getting less and less of each character, which leaves less and less time for there to actually be any character development. And a lot of the time I felt like the characters were really just doing what the plot wanted them to do rather than doing what they wanted to do. Like, I honestly a lot of the time didn't understand their motivation. In the second book especially, Shiala spends pretty much the whole time just following Serapio around, or like chasing after him, and kind of in the third book too. And while I don't mind the way that their relationship was being built, or the way that Shiala wanted to support Serapio, I just didn't feel like she would give up everything about herself for him in that way. It just didn't feel like the badass she was in the beginning, and I just ended up feeling very disappointed with her, to be honest. And not just her, like all the characters. I felt like they could have been so much more than they were, which is also a little bit connected into the bigger world and the bigger setting. So as I said, this is inspired by pre-Columbian American mythology. So we have all these cool gods at play, and there's also some really dark magic. And I wish that there had been a lot more of this dark magic and these godlike powers, because when those did come into play, it was really cool. But especially, as I said, the third book rushed through a lot of what there was. And I really think it was like the gods and their power and their magic that was the most interesting thing about this series. So when there wasn't more of it, it was somewhat disappointing. Like, there's even an element in this world of dream magic, and I really love dream magic. But again, such a tiny little piece of it, and it didn't really take it as far as I would have liked. I also felt like, in terms of the world and the setting, that it didn't really feel developed enough. And this probably also comes down to what I was saying previously with the characters, where I didn't necessarily feel like their motivations were clear. The world didn't quite feel like a real place to me. Like, it felt more like set dressing around the plot that had kind of been forced into play. And there were a lot of things where I think if you think through them, you can see that they don't really make sense. And of course, this is a fantasy novel. To some degree, you do have to suspend your belief, but I found myself suspending it a lot more than I would have liked. And once again, that was true more at the end of the series as opposed to the beginning of the series. So I feel like everything I just said was really negative, and I probably don't mean to be that harsh. I do think this series is probably still better than a lot of other fantasy books that I wouldn't even bother picking up. And I did still give the second and third books like solid 3-star ratings. They're still good books. I was just really disappointed that they didn't live up to the potential that I think was set up in the first book. But as I said, I think if you've read the first book and you had a massive emotional connection to those characters, then you still might enjoy the rest of the series. Or if like the emotional connection is often what draws you in fantasy books, you also might like this. And for me, it was fine, but I just think it had so much more potential to be even better. And I'm a bit sad now that I won't get the story that I was hoping to get. Anyway, if you've read this trilogy, I would love to chat with you about it down in the comments, especially if you disagree with me. That's cool, let's chat. Or let me know if this is a series you've started and not finished, or a series you'd like to pick up at some point. Do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.